Grab your shovels and get ready to dig. It's time for Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I'm here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Hello, everyone. As we move into the second week of January, I am still settling into the new year and learning to date everything 22, but I should have that figured out sometime by December. I hope that everyone is enjoying any January holidays and celebrations. I know I personally missed the polar bear plunge this year, but for me, this past week, 5 days since I released the last episode technically, have been pretty quiet. I've been enjoying working on some renovations and projects and catching up. As I said, I'll be working on catching up and enjoying the semester probably right up until I start the spring semester in a few weeks. But I have been dusting off those good old textbooks and writing notes and making plans. I am stupid excited about this week's episode, to the point I really considered not covering this topic, which I'm aware sounds a lot like a horrible oxymoron or clickbait title. But truthfully, this is a topic that I enjoy so much that I was a bit worried about letting my personal bias leak in or take over the episode. But once I saw enough requests and that the grasshopper script spit out Turkey is next on my list, well, I just had to talk about Göbekli Tepe. Now, today's episode is going to change the format of our show completely on its head. Normally, I start off by discussing and summarizing the history of the people and the culture that leads to the site. However, since that is a very much part of the mystery of the site, we are going to just dive straight into the site itself and add all of the extra information as we go. As always, a quick disclaimer that you should always check your sources, check your facts, and more importantly, check me. And in this episode, it is going to be doubly true. Some of the theories of the site are supported in academia, but not supported by the institute in charge of the site. And some are just completely out there, and some are weird theories and questions that I just have. And don't worry, I will totally disclaimer which theory is which, and not throw out any of my ideas and questions until later on. I'll make sure to make it as clear as possible which is which. If you took any form of world history, you may not have heard about this site at all. To be completely honest, this is something that I stumbled across when doing independent research years ago, and again later when listening to another podcast. But when you're studying human history, they normally teach you how originally humans were hunter-gatherers, which did exactly like the name suggested, and hunted and gathered their food. This is a very transparent description of what went down. But what you almost certainly were also taught was that they then, after that, domesticated animals and food. Agriculture first, religion second. Now, yes, plant species can be domesticated. We do it now all the time. What I mean is that people, humans, began to select crops and deliberately raise them to be eaten or hybridize the plants. The most famous example that you've probably heard in recent history is Gregor Mendel's pea plants in recent times, where he deliberately removed parts of one plant to pollinate another. Depending upon the species of plant depends upon how hard that is. In the case of pea plants, they normally self-pollinate, so it's pretty easy to crack open the buds in this case. In the case of other plants, think of wildflowers now. They're often open to the world, not self-contained, and so it takes a lot of time, normally several seasons, depending upon the plant, to see results. And to complicate this even further, if a trait is dominant or recessive, it'll change how long that trait will take to show up in the plant. And adding breeding animals to that? Naturally, the conclusion to all of that and what was originally taught was that once humans switched to this agriculture, they started to build permanent structures and eventually created writing, poetry, and art. Because when a task takes that much time, it is no longer feasible to chase food across the country. Domestication allowed a bigger yield of food and more constant. The first form of writing was, I believe, based on either laborers, wages, or agricultures. I really can't remember which. But I do know that it is currently credited to be from the Mesopotamia and was called cuneiform or Sumerian. But to be totally honest, even that is currently up for debate among some scholars on whether or not the written language was a concept that popped up multiple times independently of each other or something that evolved linearly. But no matter how interesting the topic, that's not what today's focus is about. No, what today's focus is the previous path of development. Hunt/gather leads to agriculture, leads to farming and architecture. Göbekli Tepe is where history once again proves my favorite concept true. No matter how much you think you know, there is always more to learn. In 1960 or 1964-ish, two universities, Chicago and Istanbul, studied Göbekli Tepe as part of a greater research and discovered a few odds and ends that made them think that there was a possible cemetery or outpost or something on the hill in the Anatolia region of Turkey. Maybe Byzantine, one source said. In a modern-day Turkey, this is pretty close to the Syrian border. Still extremely interesting, and it gathered enough interest to warrant a 399-page report that you can find links to on the blog, but basically swept up in the general interest and importance in the region and just labeled as an archaeological site of interest. To be totally fair to the original universities, they did the best they could in the time and money allowed, and with the latest information and tools available. But within the report, and gosh, it feels absolutely rude to call what they found as bits and bobs, they summed it up in a single paragraph that happened to catch the eye of a gentleman named Klaus Schmidt. He went back in 1993 to the site and eventually convinced the German Archaeological Institute, the correct name in German spells the initials DAI, so that's how I'll be referring them to through the rest of the way of the episode to help him. And they ended up excavating the mound and quickly realized that the hill, which was named Göbekli Tepe, which translated to Pot-Belly Man because of the way it looked, was actually a completely artificial mound, hiding a series of buried structures that we now know as Göbekli Tepe. So if I ever claim a site is lost or abandoned, this is my new standard. Was it buried in the ground and actually abandoned? Even one of the videos I was watching mentioned that same idea. Last week's episode is actually a good example of a quote abandoned. Sometimes I forget you can't see my air quotes I'm making. If you are one of my recurring listeners, you know that I have a problem with people classifying things as abandoned or speaking in absolutes, especially when locals are still living there. But this is the one time I have no argument. At the time, it was the oldest built archaeological/architectural site. The Institute has since partnered with several firms and universities and released multiple interviews and shows about it, some news and publication companies, a bit more unorthodox than others, and perhaps not with their permission, meaning that some of the materials you find online is actually not approved by them. So when researching this further, make sure to double check where you're getting your information. I say this every episode, but feel free to check it all out on my blog. But the question for both the Institute and Schmidt was, what exactly did they find and how abandoned was it? Like, are we talking Great Pyramids or 90s grunge? The answer? Rough estimates believe that the oldest parts can be traced back to the 10th and 9th millennia BC. We are talking about 11,000 to 10,000 of years ago, and some sources were quoting even earlier than that. That means that in the context of hunter-gatherers, this would have been pre-pottery Neolithic, which means that our original and earliest understandings of the hunter-gatherer archaeological discussion I was having earlier, yeah, you can basically throw that out. To throw some context, the last of the mammoths died about 4,000 years ago on Wrangell Island, I think, or Wrangell Island, meaning that there were mammoths and ice and snow going on. You literally cannot compare it to anything else we've talked about, not the pyramids or any other structures that I was able to find. I mean, mammoths and woolly mammoths, imagine that. Now, since its discovery, several other remains were found within the region, and last year an article in October came out and saying that they found an older site. But Göbekli Tepe is the site that started it all and made us realize that we need to redefine our understanding of the relationship between religion, settlement, and culture. Part of what makes this site so amazing is that we really don't know. We can find remains of potential food and grain sources. They must have started grading after construction or before. We can find animal bones. But as far as we were originally aware, we had not seen any large-scale settlements or religious congregations to this scale before, and originally didn't think that it was possible. So the magnitude of this find cannot be understated, much less finding others just like it. The amount of research and information is astronomical. I included several papers and honestly haven't even read all of them yet. Now, before we get into the theories of what it all meant and could have meant, let's walk through the site itself. So, as I said, it's part of a larger grouping of sites called Taz Tepeles. And Göbekli Tepe contains some of the oldest known megaliths. If you look at the oldest part of the site, it starts off as circles with extremely skinny monoliths in the shape of teeth. Now, all these sources commented on them being skinny, but serious, they are super skinny. Looking at photographs, you normally see the photos are taken of the larger ring, which has two T's, and now that's what I'll be calling the megaliths from now on, going down the middle and a series of smaller T's around the outer rings, and then walls of rock and rubble between them. Looking between the debris, you can see how the roofs, if they would have had them, would have gone, probably with a much more lightweight material, crafting spaces in between and around the supports. Eventually, they switched from the circles to the rectangles, and it was suggested that they would have buried the previous or unneeded areas. But what's most captivating is that each of the T's and a lot of the surrounding areas are completely covered in carvings, mostly animals, ones that would have been around during the time. So a few extinct species, but some notable that you might recognize, and masks with human characters and carved human skulls. And we're going to get to that aspect just a little bit later. Now, once again, I'm going to do a thing where I walk through just a couple of the photos with you guys. So you'll see some really beautiful photos with mood lighting and things like that. And you'll see the most famous, like a pillar 43, I think it's called. And then you'll see another one is the column with the carving of a dog. And I feel like a lot of times the reasons that some of these particular columns and monoliths are pointed out, in addition to the fact that they're the oldest, is also because they are the clearest. And they're also normally figures that we can recognize. You can recognize the dog as a dog. You can recognize a scorpion as a scorpion. Versus the hands that you'll see on some of the other ones meant to be the figure, it kind of gets lost in the greater context of the. And there are several sites that showed the hand drawings in the museums and things where they went through and sketched it out. And if you weren't trained to look for this, I could genuinely see how you would just glance over it. To be honest, I have not spent a lot of my career looking at ruins in school. So it's not hard to see why it makes such a strong impact, especially when you get to their 3D relief. There are several figures that are clearly 3D, and it's some sort of cat. And I saw this particular figure a lot through a couple different areas. You can see the teeth and the claws and what looks like almost like the gums are pulled back with a long tail. And then you can see something that looks similar to a cow, but it's clearly an older ancestor. So seeing this is like a little time capsule in space and time. But it seems that when researching, one site would claim something or some aspect was not covered there. And then another article dated 3 weeks later would claim that they found evidence or the artifact in question because they cleaned out a new area. So when speaking in absolutes, the only conclusions I feel safe speaking about are the figures are male. There is one female that was definitely added later on, but the original figures are very clearly male. There were heads discovered that were changed after death. They keep finding more information, and the only time I can remember this becoming influential in popular culture is when this show, The Gift, popped up on Netflix. It's a Turkish drama, and I have only watched a few episodes because I basically just binged during breaks, and I haven't had time this break. And also, I'm only allowed to make so many comments on set design and architecture per movie or episode before my friends cut me off. But documentaries are fair game. However, among the locations that the show was filmed at includes, dun-dun-dun, Göbekli Tepe, Turkey. There's also several other locations and several other sites, and the show does follow the plot of a novel. As a warning, the show is rated for mature audiences only, so for my younger audience, please skip it. But what this show did was bring into major conversations this topic, and I noticed that for many of the people I would talk to, they genuinely didn't realize that this was a real place, which is incredibly upsetting to think about, that the research of all of the universities and others were basically being ignored. In this location alone, there are sculptures with vultures, scorpions, and an assortment of animals we only have bones of, faces and totems, an entire history that deserves to be discovered. But next comes the most important part. What exactly did they use it for? So the DAI says that in a single line that it was a place possibly of ritual and cult. Other articles will call it a possible religious temple or gathering, which is led by the idea that there isn't a hearth or water or anything that suggests year-long living arrangements, as well as the various figures. The skulls, the one I mentioned being altered, there are documented cases of skull worship and cults in the region. I found articles for the skulls all the way from 2017, one with a person from the DAI saying that they found 7 fragments and that they could have been used for ancestor worship. From there, it just gets into the weird. One of the oldest arguments I heard was that this was way too advanced for anyone during that time, and the degradation in quality from the oldest site to the youngest sites in terms of construction is because aliens assisted and then left. There are several television shows that discuss the possibility. One series I found was discussed in a Forbes article talking about, quote, what archaeologists really think about. It's an older article, but it discusses a series of writings where the archaeologists basically do what I did in the Tartarian episode. They research and summarize the arguments and then analyze and discuss the validity of the sources. I haven't read them all the way, but some of them that I did, I felt like did a great job focusing on the sources and the information without coming across as super condescending. You know, when the idea was introduced, what the article was from, while others didn't. But for me, to propose my radical crazy theories or maybe just offer an opinion in general, one thing that I felt supported the idea of the skull being important to worship was the way some of the masks are carved. But one thing against it is that when a carving or work erodes, the finer details are always the first to go. So if there was any additional ornamentation, it's long gone. The lack of hearths and the various figures does lend high importance to it being religious or temporary. But as to whether or not it was religious, I think that a lot more would need to be uncovered at the site or another site in the region before a definitive stance could be taken on exactly what that religion would look like. Even the heads, or possibly decapitated heads depicted. Could it have been a deity that was only a head? Could they have believed that the soul was in the head instead of in the heart? Could it have been a funeral rite? When animal eyes are seen in the dark, they will often reflect light in the pupils. And while we know the biology behind it, could they have thought it was the soul looking out? The number of theories around this is kind of ridiculous. We could start now and finish in like 3 years talking through all the possibilities. But the amount of time construction would have taken, could it have been a stop along the way to the other structures? A series of paths of refuge? A temple for the other locations to pilgrimage? A place to pray and rest between hunts? Without a lot more information, I think we may never know. But I, for one, am excited to see what else they can discover. If nothing else is found from the site, the way that information has been treated and the passion of some of the internet defenders, as I saw them refer to themselves, who strongly feel that the site and the DAI and other institutes have failed to get the recognition they deserve for their time and energy spent studying and understanding the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, is awe-inspiring. This site has had a lasting impact on our understanding and sparked the idea of discovery and the unknown into a newer generation. But more importantly, in a lot of ways, it has allowed the conversation to join academia in popular culture. I myself was inspired by it, wanting to break out my Indiana Jones hat and run off crocodile hunter style into the trenches. And to me, changing the conversation, or rather sparkling the conversation, is the first step. But once again, a big thank you to all my listeners. I know I say this every week, but please rate and review. As a pretty new podcast with only 14 episodes, excluding the bonus shows, sharing the show really makes a difference. If you liked it, loved it, hate it, let me know. I love feedback and hearing from everyone, and more importantly, sparking conversation. We again have a Facebook page and private group, both of which are under the same name, Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. One Website is architectureinc.design.blog, and everything will be linked in the show notes. And I will say this throughout the entirety of January, but have a wonderful new year. And as always, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.